Press, and
Awesome.
we're covering the film festival.
That's awesome, you guys.
Yeah.
That's terrific. Okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dia,
And I'm Delaney.
and we're from the Santa Barbara Middle School's Team Press here with.
Ben Skinner.
Hi, nice to meet you. So, after being in the war zone, Jeremy Satchel said life was dull. How was life after covering the war zone for you?
After covering Afghanistan, I had an interesting window on it. I was there covering the elections, the midterm elections 3 years ago, and what I saw was a lot of problems and a lot of questions why we were there in the first place, and also the will of a lot of people to actually stand up and exercise their own ability to choose their own future by voting, despite the odds against them.
Obama said this is not a war of choice. Do you personally think it was a war of choice?
The war in Afghanistan? That's an excellent question. I think every war is a war of choice to a certain extent. I think that because of 9/11 and because the network that we knew was responsible for 9/11, the Al-Qaeda network, was at the time based and being given shelter, being given aid and comfort, as it were, by the ruling government of Afghanistan, the Taliban. It was more a war of reaction against a distinctive attack. You can take the pacifist argument that we should never be in a war. You can also take the argument that there was a certain point where we should have exited that war before it turned into something else, before it turned into a civil war. We haven't, and 1,500 Americans are dead now, and war is always a terrible, terrible decision. It's a meaning a severe decision, meaning a decision that no individual, no president, no administration should ever take lightly. And frankly, I think they rarely do take them lightly. What he was comparing Afghanistan to, by the way, was Iraq, which by most people's estimation today, as a result of understanding that the information on weapons of mass destruction was false, that was more of a war of choice, and that's what he was comparing it to.
Do you think this war depended on Obama's approval?
Boy, that's hard. You mean, to be clear on that question, you mean, do I think his continuation of the war depended on his approval? I think there's no question that an American president who inherits a war, as it were, as President Obama did, has to make a decision about how to either prosecute that war or get out. And my feeling is that he, as I said in there, I think there was a bit of drift early on where he was focused on other things. The economy was cratering. The global recession was on. He was trying to get health care through, and there wasn't a lot of leadership on Afghanistan. Frankly, he was getting good numbers on Afghanistan early on. Now, not so much. And you ask most Americans today what we're doing there, and they would have trouble telling you exactly why we're still over there, why we're putting men and women in harm's way.
What is your opinion on the U.S. invading other countries?
My opinion on the U.S. invading other countries is first of all, you have to understand why. In every instance. Personally, I tend towards being a pacifist. I tend towards always looking for a negotiated solution. Winston Churchill, who of course, as we know, was no pacifist, famously said, it's much better to jaw than to war. You have to say it with a British accent, meaning it's much better to talk than it is to go to war. And that's very much my opinion. I used to work for Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who ended a war in the Balkans. And he understood the use of American force, the deployment of American troops. There wasn't one ground troop that was killed American ground troop that was killed in that conflict in the Balkans. Why? Because there was a two-pronged approach. There were bombings, strategic bombings, which, again, as we've seen from this film, are no way to fight a counterinsurgency alone. But the other thing was you had Richard Holbrooke jawing. You had him getting out and talking to the leaders of Croatia, of Bosnia, of Serbia, getting them in a room and saying, people are dying, we need to stop this. And that kind of leadership I don't see in this conflict right now.
And war is a very sensitive subject. How do you talk about it in front of people so calmly and respectively.
Was I talking calmly and respectively? I appreciate you saying that. You know, it's for me. It's important to have to be motivated by passions when we talk about big important subjects, but to understand that there will be people of different opinions, and you don't get anywhere by shouting.
Will you give us your interpretation of a good journalism?
Good journalism. A good journalist is someone who seeks the truth, the whole truth, to the best of their ability and tells it. And that may not always comport with whatever their ideology is, but they tell both sides of a story. And fundamentally, part two, they do no harm in the process. So they don't hurt other people. They protect sources who've gone to great risk. This is something that journalism, I'm a third generation journalist. My grandfather started a very small paper that still runs in Connecticut. And he believed, and I believe, that journalism is the lifeblood of democracy. And when you pervert it by calling things journalism that are actually opinion, I think it becomes a problem. Now, should Jeremy Scahill or anybody else have the right to say what they want to say? Absolutely. It's called the First Amendment. But I think in my opinion, it's something other than journalism.
Reporting on the war and problems in the Middle East is intense and emotional. How did the process of covering this topic and being in Afghanistan affect your opinion on war and humankind?
Well, first of all, I shouldn't put myself on too high a pedestal here as an Afghan war correspondent. I was there covering the elections, that's it. I spent 3 months in Yemen, so I was in a different area that they covered in the film there for a longer period of time. But, you know, I think that, frankly, when I was 7 years old, my mother and father took me to Hiroshima. And what she wanted to show me was, this is what war is. And, you know, you may be learning in school that this was a just conflict, that this was total war, and we had to execute total war because we were attacked. But when you talk to a woman who, still, when we went there in 1984, was pulling glass out of her skin every morning because there was a window between her, a glass window between her and where the bomb exploded, it gives you a pretty keen sense of how terrible this is and how it affects people that have nothing to do with the conflict in the first place. So my opinion of war is you do everything in your power not to get into them.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. Pleasure.